For the last session of the day, we have as chair Joseph Kovljanic. Wow, did it. He's an archivist in the National Slovenian Archives, and he's also in the E-ARK project and in eArchiving since long ago. So, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Our last session will be about the take-up eArchiving. And our first speaker is Anders Bo Nielsen, from the senior advisor at the Danish National Archives in the section for digital archives. In short introduction, I will just say that Anders Bo is one of the most experienced digital archivists in Europe, and as such important part of eArch team. And he will share some of his rich experiences now with us. Anders, please.
Thank you. Now, we're going to move on to speaking about the experiences of the Danish National Archives in the areas of digital archiving. And it's so that if we look at our journey with digital archiving, then it began in the middle of the 1970s with digital registries, and it continued with digital documents in the late 90s. Digital registries, that's also another word for databases these days. Currently, we have ingested about 200 submissions and 30 terabyte so far this year, and we expect that before the end is over, we will reach something like 45 terabytes and 210 submissions. And they all come from the public sector, from the state level of our authorities, and as such are all digitally created and not digitized. So in total, we have holdings for about 4,500 submissions from these 45 years, and currently 300 terabyte of data. Now, of course, the huge increase in the last years is due to the public sector becoming increasingly, I would say, almost 100% digital. And the reason why we have those from the middle of the 70s is because that's when we started out, especially in the areas of registering our citizens, primarily to make certain they pay taxes. Now, digital archiving at the Danish National Archives, that is based on procedures, and it's regulated by law and executive orders. We have procedures for notification, for approval, for appraisal, submission, transfer, ingest, preservation, and access. And we have also mandatory notification and approval for state authorities implementing new IT systems. That is, before they can implement a new IT system, they have to notify the National Archives, and we will then appraise, decide whether we would like to have that preserved or not, and then we will give them the actual approval of start implementing their IT system when we find out that it has been done in a way that is compatible with our archival requirements. We also have submissions every 5th year, and some annually. We have that as an example for registries. So we have these annual submissions, so we can go back in time and look at the data from when the registry originally originated. Now, apart from, of course, procedures and regulations, we also have created quite a bit of specifications and also quite a few tools, mostly by ourselves, to support the whole work of digital archiving. Now, having seemingly all this about digital archiving in place. You might ask, why on earth does the Danish National Archives then participate in the e-archiving building block and promote its continuation and uptake? And I can say very clearly that the reason is that we know from hard experience that it is terrible to have to do all that by yourself. We can just briefly look at the last 10 years and see how things have gone when it comes to our history of digital archiving, the e-ARK, and the e-archiving building block as such. Back in 2010, we created our latest generation of information package specifications. And back then, we actually chose to use what we call CRDK for a database preservation format. It was so that back then we already had, of course, as you've seen, all the previous decades of information to take care of. And we also had, before that, been archiving databases for many years. Now, why did we at all choose to switch from our own national standard and to eArchiving? Well, we did that because we found that if not just eArchiving being better, at least than our own national specification, it had a prospect of a wider use, primarily because it, apart from being a good specification, had had the support of the European Union project Open Planets, who had adopted eArchiving for their format for racial database preservation. And eArchiving stands for Software Independent Archiving of Racial Databases, and is, apart from a Swiss specification, also then actually in reality a European Union one, since we've been in there for more than 10 years. Now, having given up our own national specification and switched on to CRDK, you might ask, why did we then again make a slight deviation? It's called DK because we had the necessity back then to add some features to eArchiving in order to reach the correct scalability. Many other users of eArchiving seem to have been archiving very small amounts of data, and for that reason, naturally, eArchiving was not designed for large amounts. Therefore, we made certain that CRDK could scale more than the original eArchiving 1.0. And naturally, we thought about, speaking about European cooperation, etc., that it shouldn't take more than a year or two, then all the other users of eArchiving would realize this need, and we would again merge on a common path towards our common specification. Now, sadly, things didn't go as smooth as we had expected, or at least not as fast. The following years, in 2012, we had a database preservation hackathon in Copenhagen, where we brought in the Swiss and the Portuguese, who were also here today, who also had their own national format. And we agreed, if not formally, then in practice, that we would give up our own specifications and adopt a common European one as soon as we had made that. It took a little time, but when we got into the e-ARK project in 2014 till 17, we managed to get rid of our own national specifications in that area and all joined forces in making certain that eARK had those functionalities that some of us had desired earlier on. And so we succeeded, at least for that part, and that was really tremendously for us to see that that could be done in such a I would say, calm and somehow also intriguing atmosphere. Now, having that success, and not just with eARK coming to the part of about database preservation, but also for the IP specifications that we made back then, naturally we moved on in 2018 and 19 with eArchiving and eARK for all, and currently we are about to move on to eArchiving and eARK 3, for which we, the Danish National Archives, also are the coordinator, as we were for the eARK for all. When it comes to our journey so far, I can say that currently we are seeing an increase in the use of E-ARK open source database preservation toolkit and the database visualization toolkit made by Keep Solutions. You've heard about that in the earlier presentations, and you've also seen earlier the overview by Jörg about the uptake of different parts of the e-archiving tools and specifications. Now, what about then the next steps about the uptake? Well, right now we are expecting to further develop, enhance and expand certain areas of e-archiving that has been briefly mentioned today, and that's specifications for the information packages and especially for the content information types. One of them being, of course, racial databases, but there are also other areas that we will look into. Then we also have the sampled software, the IP creation and validation tools we've been looking at, and we have also ourselves participated in being able to validate those tools. Naturally, we hope that at some point of time, our own tools will be possible to be replaced by the common tools, as we've already seen when it comes to things like the creation of extracts from racial databases. We have done that ourselves using the sample software created by Keeps and as part of the eArchiving building block. And we have seen agencies, state authorities using it in order to export to us. You've also seen it being used by quite a few private companies, some of them so large you would imagine that they should have created proprietary software themselves, but no, they have more or less waited until somebody like the EU actually went forward and said, let's try to create some sample software here. And I should mention that even though the sample software is partly meant for inspiration, as we heard about when it comes to implementing it yourself, it has turned out to be production ready for at least these rather large databases that we have received. So we are very pleased about that, and we look forward to the further development of those specifications and tools, and not to forget also the training and the outreach as we are having here today, as well as the reference architecture, which is important when it comes to trying to figure out how to implement e-archiving in your running systems in the both short and longer run. Now, looking further at the coming years, when we end by 2021, we do not really know what's going to happen with e-archiving. We naturally hope that it will continue one way or the other, and depending on the continuation, we will then either create the things that we still need as part of a common European development, or we will have to resort to a national development of the small things regarding specifications and software we still find we need. And in that case, naturally, we'll have to take more considerations towards our own national needs than the common European ones. I don't hope that situation arises, but we are prepared for that because we have decided that one way or the other we are going to implement as much as e-archiving as we can when we reach the end of 2022. So we are ready by the beginning of 2023 to move on with our new specifications, which then have been awaited for a long time by certain of our producers and their consultants. I should also say that in the areas of digital archiving, there's also sometimes people who are very, very uneasy and not very happy if you, after just 5 years, change your specifications, because this is really a building block with very sharp corners, I should say. It is, at least in Denmark, a huge thing to change legislation that affects all parts of the public sector, and of course also all of their consultants. So one way or the other, we are going on with new regulations and new executive orders implementing e-archiving, which of course then will be followed by guidelines, etc., all that it takes to make certain that all of the public sector in a very few years will then switch on to using the e-archiving specifications. Now, when it comes to the actual coverage, we estimate that it should be by 2023 something like 99%. Why do we do that? Well, simply because we will issue an executive order telling people that they have to use it. And that should more or less solve the matter. That is at least how it is normally in Denmark. Now, what will then be created? Well, we know for certain that all the e-ARK submission information packages, the SIPs, will be created then by all at the state level authorities. Now here we are speaking about the executive branch and the judicial branch, because the legislative branch has exempted themselves from that kind of regulation, as seems to be the case in many countries. So that's going to be all the ministries and all their agencies and all the courts. Apart from that, which is of course important by itself, it will also be a fact for all the regional and local authorities. We have 5 regions. They take primarily care of health, and we have 98 municipalities. And that is because that the rules regarding archiving are the same for both the state level and for the regional and local level, at least for the vast majority of the regulation, and as such, they will also follow on. So that comes then to the part about the SIPs, but naturally, there's also other parts regarding the e-archiving specification we'll have to look at. I will come back to that later on, and maybe that will also be mentioned, maybe, when it comes to questions. Now, apart from the public sector in Denmark, we also have the option of looking at the uptake in the Danish realm, or as we also call it, the Kingdom of Denmark. We will naturally urge the adoption of e-archiving soon after the uptake in Denmark, and that will be with the cooperation we're having with Greenland and the Faroe Islands. And since the EC is very concerned about uptake and projects, and I can only present you one in Denmark so far, but with a 99% coverage in a few years, I will then also add on Greenland and Faroe Islands as possible and most likely candidates. And that, of course, will mean a huge increase in at least geographical coverage, even outside the EU and Europe. Now, going to something a bit more seriously, even though I'm going back home to Denmark soon, having meetings with the Faroe Islands archives, and the Icelandic, by the way, there are other parts that we have to look at when it comes to our uptake of e-archiving. Now, we are going to have a bit more focus on access. We, the DNA, has, apart from being coordinator of the e-ARK for all and e-ARK 3, supporting the e-archiving building block, also been responsible for the dissemination information packages. And we hope, and now we are more maybe speaking about hope, we hope that we're going to have these specifications in use by all public archives by 2023. Naturally, the only public archive when it comes to the state level is the National Archives of Denmark, but we do have, as I mentioned before, the regional level as well as the municipalities. They have very wisely realized that it is not a task for a single municipality to manage e-archiving. At least it's better to do that in cooperation. So they have joined forces, and therefore we only have a few active digital archives at the municipal level and at the regional level. I expect them to still be using these specifications, if not by 2023, then very soon thereafter. First of all, because it makes a huge benefit if you're going from the common SIP, which they will have to use due to national legislation, if you then have also an AIP and a DIP that is compatible with the SIP. It's simply a matter of being able to easily transfer and migrate those information packages that you receive. Everything, though, is not very easy. We do have a lot of challenges, not as much on the level about specifications and software development, even though that is really difficult when you look at it in depth. Now, we also have problems when it comes to the judicial matters. Now, one of the challenges that we are having is giving authorities access to their own data in public archives. And that is partly due to the interpretation of the Common European Union GDPR and national implementation of the GDPR legislation regarding archives, which, if you look at the GDPR, makes it possible for each member state to a certain degree, at least, to exempt archiving when it comes to certain areas of history and public interest to the general rules of the GDPR. I just saw by coincidence that at the other side of the hall out here, we have a meeting by the European group taking care of data protection, the Data Protection Board, and maybe we could, if not during this coffee break, then when we are about to end this session, try to grab hold of some of those and tell them how difficult it is, in fact, to both be able to preserve data and then give access to it in order to use all that information we are having. So all our ideas about having an efficient way of using artificial intelligence, one way or the other, makes it necessary to adopt or maybe at least interpret our legislation regarding GDPR to digital archives. We hope ourselves that we will, together with the Danish Department of Finance, be able to make a kind of case in which we will make them able to get access to their own data, one way or the other, primarily their data from their everyday administration of financial matters in the department. And we hope also that we can then have this way of doing it made acceptable in other areas. Otherwise, we will never get the full benefit, in the public sector at least, for giving access to what we have made digital. So that is one of the things we will be doing as well in the eArchiving building block in the coming years. And that is one of the rather large stones we have on our road to eArchiving. Now, I should also say that it is difficult as such to handle digital archiving. First of all, as you have been told, we, of course, had something in place already. We have something that we have more or less set as history, and now we're having a future specification. So nobody wants to have too many generations of specifications lying around, but you should expect to at least be able to handle 3, the previous, the current, and the future. And that goes for almost everything in a digital archive. I've just mentioned a few, such as IP specifications, tools, regulations, guidance. We also have to migrate our archives to current specifications. Note that, of course, we want to migrate as little as possible because migration is costly. But next year, while we're working on the final pieces necessary to be able to make the full implementation of eArchiving, we will be migrating our previous generation of our specifications. That is, not just specifications, we'll be migrating the data, of course, to the current specifications. And that's going to be a rather large task that you should all be aware of that you will have to do as well. So digital archiving, even though it seems nice and easy with the eArchiving building block, does take skills and resources. I will, looking at the time, move on to saying that it will, I hope, the building block, be work in progress, even though we will have, one way or the other, as I said, sufficient amount of specifications and tools in 2022 to be able to implement it in regulations as well, apart from specification software, to get a full support in the public sector. But it takes skills and it takes expertise to get there. We can also see that our need for software development based on the specifications and on new content type specification, that is further descriptions of specific content like geodata or relational databases or other things like that, they all require funding one way or the other. So we need to have an active community that are willing to participate both with ideas, with stating their needs, because we do not know the needs of everybody out there wanting to use eArchiving. Also with, as we've heard about, participating in development specifications and software, even though we fully understand that at some levels it might be too detailed and too hard to expect just anybody coming from outside to find small technical flaws in our specifications. But we do want to have that active community around us. Now, we want to have cooperation, and not only because of the current situation. If we look at how our governments are using technology, then we can see that it develops rapidly. I can give you an example, namely that more and more agencies seem to desire to place everything in the cloud. Now, apart from GDPR, that itself is a huge challenge, because how do you get hold of data if it's without your reach? It takes some tremendous, I would say, agreements with cloud providers, which they're very often are willing to make in order to get all those precautions that you have to have when it comes to getting hold of your data when you have to archive it. Another problem we have about technology is simply that because we have no real competition, at least we're speaking about an oligopoly out there, if not a monopoly sometimes, it gets more and more difficult for us in the archives to get hold of the specifications. We've been there before with the war between Microsoft and the Open Document Foundation and, Open Document organizations as such, as the ODF, but it seems really hard to be able to continue to getting those specifications. If everything lies in the cloud, why will then be need for future and detailed specifications of your files and information on your own machine? So that's a risk that we will simply end up having all those specifications lying with a few providers. That might sound a bit gloomy right here in this almost sunny afternoon, but that's one way and one reason why we should continue to cooperate on this area, both at a national level, but very much at a European Union level. I would say briefly that no archive can handle the challenges entirely on their own. And I do recall one visit 20 years ago at the National Archives in Washington, in which they said, well, why on earth, back at that time, actually we had the exact amount of staff, the same amount of staff between us and the National Archives, And they said, that, why on earth are you doing digital archiving in Denmark? Why don't you go together with all of Scandinavia? And we said, well, we've done that, but that resulted in a few hundreds of years following that. So we'll try to solve it with voluntary cooperation this time. So I would say that the e-archiving building block can help us to handle the challenges together, and I hope that we will also be able to do that in the future. So with the promise of Christmas, digital Christmas, I will then end my presentation, and I will give the word on to the next one.
Thank you, Anders Bo. I think that we have some minutes for a few questions or comments, so please, floor is yours. Yes, please.
First of all, thank you. It was a very good presentation, and you also expressed a good challenge for the sustainability, because the uptake is a real problem for everything. And I just want to know about the comments of the DG Connect about how building blocks are going to solve or address this issue, because the migration is a problem. In 10 years, Denmark made 5 specification changes, and 3 of them are actually the E-ARK parts. And if you keep them and you don't migrate them into the current specification, you will end up in 200 years with 100 specification, then it's not an archive. And on the other hand, if you do it in every 2 years, then there will be a problem of the lost in translation issue. Because although the data may not change, the eArch 3, for example, adds more the rules, validations, and etc. The validations may fail. The data didn't change, but then you add more compatibility, and the data is not validated anymore. So how are you going to control this issue in order to maintain the trust? Thank you. This is for the DG Connect, actually.
Okay, maybe I'm not aware if I'm the right person to comment on that, but if anyone else would like to, or if anyone else have a question or some other comments. Yes, please.
Yes, since you brought up the possibility of cloud storage, I was wondering how the discussions have been going regarding the Cloud Act that was implemented by the Americans, and how that would implement security risks for moving digital archiving for the entire government.
Well, so far it is more or less being discussed with the provider of IT solutions in Denmark, who is responsible for providing solutions for the Danish state. Nobody seems to be willing to do that for several reasons. We still have a few bits of legislation making it impossible to transfer data, at least certain parts of data, outside of the control of the Danish state. There are these more obscure things like, in case of war, that's certain information you have to be able to erase rapidly. So far they're considering, could we make a national cloud which is controlled by our state? So it is mostly in the private cloud area when it comes to any kind of data which is still covered by some kind of confidentiality. Naturally, if it's fully publicly available, you could consider who is the cheapest one to actually manage our data. But of course, the concern goes on all those data that are in fact confidential. And even though we've also had discussions with Microsoft and others and trying to figure out where we stand legally, so far we are holding our horses in general regarding the use of clouds for any kind of confidential data. But as I noticed, as I said, even for data that might be not confidential, it can be difficult to archive it if you don't have a very clear agreement with your provider. Which is why when it comes to us actually approving the the use of an IT system, we urge the producers, the state agencies, to make certain that they make an agreement before they start using the system about how they're going to export this to the public archive, because you know that upfront that you will have to do it, at least in most cases.
Okay, we have time just for one short question. Okay.
Very short. How long it will take to migrate?
If you're speaking about the migration we have from our previous generation, it will be done in about a year or two. It's not that hard. As long as you have certain you have enough I/O in your systems, you can do that, even though it's several terabytes. And of course, what will happen is that, as we all know, also that validation improves over the years. So most likely, and that's how it is with archiving, we will find data which is faulty, which we thought were perfect 5 or 10 years ago.